The cell was damp. The walls breathed cold into her skin. The only light came from a single torch that flickered in the corridor outside its. Flame bent and swayed in the drafts that whispered through the stones. She could hear footsteps above her slow measured hand. Heavy with authority in her chest, the heart beat not with life, but with the weight of inevitability for weeks. They had told her nothing. Not the crime she had committed, not the name of her accuser, only that the king himself had signed the order. That by the end of this night, she would never see the stars. Again the year was 1531, and the punishment she was about to face was older than the very walls that trapped her. It was whispered of only in private. Halsey's sentence not written in public. Law books, but carried in the unspoken will of kings to be buried alive, not in the earth like the common dead, but sealed in darkness while breath still clung to the body. This was a fate reserved for the enemies one could not execute in public, for those whose death would bring scandal, for lovers whose existence could ruin a dynasty, for traitors whose blood could not be spilled without angering powerful families. Was death and disgrace combined in one final act outside the palace gates? London slept. Under a fog thick as wool, the streets were empty. The Thames carried the smell of wet stone and tar from the docks. A cart rattled over cobbles, far away its wheels grinding like the gears of a slow execution. Guards arrived without ceremony, 2 men. In blackened armor faces, blank under the brim of their helmets, they opened the cell door without a word. She rose without protest, for in her mind there was no longer a path to mercy. Led her through a passage that wound beneath the palace kitchens, through an arched stone door into a courtyard lit only by a crescent moon. In the center hall, hidden under tarps and planks, a hole had been dug into the frozen ground. Beside it, a wooden coffin stood open, its iron hinges glinting in the moonlight. The order had been given in the council chamber just hours before. The king had not spoken her name aloud. He only stared at the councillors, his eyes as cold as the frost on the windows. The accusation and affair with a courtier close to the queen, but there was more. She had overheard secrets in the royal apartments, secrets that if spoken aloud could change alliances and perhaps even crowns. And so the choice was made. She would vanish without trial, without a public record. Chronicles would record only that she had died of sudden illness. The men who had dug the pit worked in silence. Each knew that speaking of this night would mean his own end. They moved like shadows under the orders of the captain, a man whose loyalty was measured in coin and survival. Coffin was ready. She was told to step forward. Her eyes moved to the sky clouds, drifted past the moon. She tried to breathe in the cold night air, as if storing it, as if she could carry it with her into the dark. The captain spoke softly in her ear. There is still time to confess. She said nothing. What could confession mean when the sentence had already been signed? History remembers kings for their battles, for their marriages and their treaties, but rarely for nights like this, with a quiet cruelty of power works in shadow. There are records hidden in archives in Paris and Vienna, letters between ambassadors, speaking of mysterious disappearances at court, hints of lovers who simply ceased to exist. These hints are never enough for certainty, only enough to stain the edges of history with suspicion. When she stepped into the coffin, the wood was colder than the air. Rough splinters scraped her silk gown. She lay down slowly, not because she wished to delay, but because she wanted her final movements to be her own. The guards hesitated for a moment, perhaps expecting tears, a plea, but she stared at the sky until the lid closed. Darkness came fast, a weight above her, then the sound of nails being driven into the wood. One by one each strike a drumbeat, counting down the last minutes of air. She could hear the muffled sounds of shovels, the soft thud of earth against the coffin lid. Smell of damp soil seeped into the wood. The sound of her own breath grew louder in her ears. Centuries later, in the ruins of an old Tudor manor, workmen digging foundations would uncover a wooden box rotten with age inside. The faint trace of fabric still clung to fragments of bone. No official record matched the remains, but local legend had long told of a lady who had crossed. The king and whose ghost walked the orchard at night, carrying a single rose. The truth of burial alive is more disturbing than legend historical. Evidence shows it was used in medieval and early modern Europe, not always as a public spectacle. Often it was carried out in secret, reserved for crimes where blood could not be shed. In the Holy Roman Empire, noblewomen convicted of infanticide were sometimes buried alive in open pits before the eyes of the townspeople. In England, the punishment was called peine forte et dure. When used for those who refused to plead in court, the accused would be pressed with stones until death. In private royal orders, burial alive was a quieter weapon. It erased both the body and the name for the victim. The first minutes were spent in shock, the body still capable of breathing, the lungs filling with air. As the oxygen diminished, every gasp became sharper, the chest burning. Instinct to claw at the walls overwhelming in the silence, the mind began to betray itself. Memories came in flashes, faces of parents' laughter, at feasts a voice calling from far away, and then nothing. It was more than punishment. It was the deliberate erasure of a human being from history, a tool of power designed to make even the memory of rebellion dangerous. Tonight you can still walk the old palace grounds in London. The stones whisper under your feet. Somewhere beneath them are the bones of those who vanished. No tomb, no marker, only the weight of centuries. Above them, asterisk. The palace awoke the next morning to the sound of bells from St. Paul's. Merchants called out in the markets, horses clattered over cobblestones, and in the royal chambers the queen smiled at her ladies as though the night before had been like any other. There was no mention of the missing woman, no whisper of the work done in the cold courtyard. It court silence was survival, so the silence became absolute. But power does not rest easily. The king paced in his private study. A fire burned in the hearth, yet the heat did not seem to touch him. His hands gripped the back of a carved chair, his mind turning over the same thought again and again. What if someone saw? What if someone speaks in his world? A single rumor could undo years of alliances. The burial was meant to erase a problem. It had planted a secret, and secrets have a way of growing far from London. In the courts of Europe, ambassadors wrote their coded letters. One spoke of a mysterious absence in the English queen's household. Another hinted that a gift meant for a foreign prince had been intercepted. A velvet box containing a ring inside was a hidden compartment with a folded scrap of parchment. It bore only a few words. They mean to bury me alive. The handwriting was delicate but hurried. There was no name, only the faint stain of what looked like a tear in the corner. The ambassador who received it kept it in his private collection for years. It passed through the hands of his descendants until a fire in the 19th century destroyed much of the archive. Only a partial copy survived. Historians dismissed it as romantic invention, but others saw in it a rare glimpse of truth. In England, the practice of secret burial by royal order was not codified in law. It existed in the shadows under the authority of the sovereign, and it was always carried out by a small circle of loyal enforcersmen whose faces never appeared in portraits, men whose names were never written in official records. These were the hands that shaped the darkest acts of the crown. One such man was recorded only as Master Hughesy appears briefly in an inventory of palace servants in 1529a. Line beside his name notes duties, confidential, nothing more. Yet across the channel, a French chronicle mentions an English agent who oversaw the punishment of a noblewoman accused of betraying the king's counsel. The description of the night, the cold courtyard, the open coffin matches exactly what we know of the event in 1531. The reasons for burial alive varied. In some cases, it was religious symbolism, the victim entombed while still breathing, a mockery of the grave, a final act of domination over both body and soul. In others, it was purely political. To spill blood was to risk martyrdom. To bury someone in silence was to make them disappear without the power of a public death. In monasteries and convents, there were whispered stories of nuns punished for breaking vows. The church never admitted it, but records in small rural parishes sometimes list a burial without a death date, an impossible contradiction, unless one knew the truth. The victim buried under the chapel floor, prayers recited above as the last breaths faded. Asterisk. In 1547, a letter from a Spanish envoy described a shocking rumor from Scotland. A young man accused of seducing a noble lady was said to have and buried alive beneath the stables of the castle. The official record claims he was banished, but no trace of him exists after that. Years later, workers repairing the stables found a cavity under the floor. Inside were bones and the rusted remains of a chain. To the rulers of the time, such acts were not cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were weapons of statecraft. If a threat could not be tried publicly without risking scandal or rebellion, it had to be removed quietly. Burial alive was perfect. For that it left no battlefield, no public execution scaffold, no final words to inspire the masses, only silence. But silence does not last forever. In the old palace gardens, roots sometimes push up strange objects after heavy rains. A fragment of carved woody rusted clasp, a piece of cloth so rotted it turns to dust in the hand, each one a faint echo of those who once lived and breathed here, those who looked up at the moon for the last time before the earth closed over them. Somewhere in the archives of forgotten country houses, there are still locked boxes unopened for centuries, containing the letters and journals of those who knew, those who saw the earth being filled in over the living and carried that memory to their own graves. These hidden truths form a second map of history, a shadow map running beneath the surface of the one we are taught, where dates of coronations and wars are matched by dates of disappearances and quiet punishments. To follow that map is to walk a path lined with fear, because to know these things is to understand that power was never only about law or justice, it was about control of breath itself. Centuries have passed since the last royal order for a living burial was whispered into the dark halls of power. Palaces stand as museums, now the torches replaced by electric light, the courtyards swept clean for tourists. Beneath the stone there are places where the air still feels close and heavy, where footsteps echo too long, and where silence hangs like a memory. In the archives of the British Library, a scholar once found a curious entry in the journal of a court musician written in 1602. It described the sudden disappearance of a lady in waiting. Musician claimed to have heard the sound of shovels late at night beneath the orchard wall and a low voice reciting a prayer. The entry ends with the line, "The earth closed over her as the moon hid its face." The scholar who read it could not find any other mention of the woman in court records. It was as though she had never existed. Such fragments of truth surface like bones in a plowed field. They are often dismissed as folklore, romantic embellishment, or the product of fevered imagination, yet they align too perfectly across countries and centuries to be coincidence. In Italy, the Medici were rumored to have used the same punishment. In France, it was whispered of in connection with certain mistresses who knew too much. In Russia, it was said to have been used in the frozen earth of remote estates. Always in silence, always without a trace in official law. The cruelty of burial alive lay not only in the death itself, in the stripping away of identity, the victim's name removed from chronicles, their portrait destroyed or left unfinished, their possessions quietly dispersed to the world. They were not even dead. They simply were not imagined for a moment. The darkness closing in, the weight of the lid, the smell of wood and soil, the muffled world above, a world you can still hear but no longer touch. Every instinct tells you to fight, to claw for air, to force the wood to give. But the wood does not give, and the earth only grows heavier. In the courts of the 16th century, such deaths were spoken of only in coded ways. A toast absent at a banquet, a dance where one partner was missing, a seat left empty at a feast and never filled again. To those who understood these signals the message was clear. One more voice, and then silence. There are modern parallels to this kind of erasure, not in the form of literal burial, but in the ways power still makes people vanish. Prison cells without trial, records wiped from public view, lives reduced to a line in a closed file. The tools have changed, but the principle is the same too. Remove not just the person, but the memory of the person. In some ways, this is more dangerous than a public execution. A public death can be mourned, it can inspire, but when the world never knows you are gone, there can be no monument, no protest, no story told in the open. Yet history is stubborn. Even the most carefully hidden acts leave traces. A letter hidden in a wallah, rumor passed down through a family, an unearthed coffin in a place where no grave should be. Truth resists burial. Story of those buried alive by royal order is more than a curiosity from the past. It is a reminder of how absolute power shapes not only life and death, but the very memory of both. It shows how fear can be used to erase a person more completely than the grave. How silence can be more final than any executioner's blade tonight. If you walk alone past the old palace walls, you may feel it, the press of history in the air, the quiet spaces between the stones, and in that silence, perhaps the faintest whisper, not of words but of breath. Those who once fought for a final gasp beneath the earth. Thank you for walking with me through this forgotten corner of history. If you felt the weight of this story, if you believe the past still speaks to the present, then stay with us. There are more truths to unearth, more voices to recover from the silence.